You know, I love remodel projects because they always teach me lessons. On today's build show, we're talking about lessons learned from a stucco failure. On today's episode, I'm going to show you a remodel project, and we're going to learn a few lessons from this house that I think we can apply to new construction. So here's the background first. 20-year-old house here. I like to call this a de-Tuscanizing project. We do these a lot. Rather Tuscan-styled house. Clients wanted to go a little more contemporary, and we had a bunch of old windows that were rotted. Funny thing is, these windows were not that old though. Here's the old windows that came out. Fairly high quality wood window. But look at all this rot, ton of rot on these windows. Now this was a good manufacturer, but we had a couple things we can learn from this. And we also have a pretty decent stucco failure on the back of the house that I think is the real lesson learned. Let's walk up here and I'll show you what we can learn from this house. So front of the house, stone facade. Here's one of the windows we're replacing out. We're doing some Marvin Contemporary Series, much better window than what we had before because it's a wood window that's super efficient, but it's clad with aluminum. So now we're not gonna have those rot and maintenance issues we had before. But walk over here, and here's where I think we can see some lessons on this house. So here, wood window, a ton of rot. I was over here before one time, and I was able to sink my knife all the way in. This brick mold on the outside of the window just totally gone. But look at this facade, rock facade. And stone, just like brick when it's applied, has an air gap, a natural air gap behind it. This right here is a connector that's connecting the house to the stone so the stone doesn't fall off. It's called a brick tie commonly. This one had a little bit of rust, but it looks like it was in pretty good shape. And here's that air gap right here. Now here's where I think we find a very interesting building science lesson. Brick, stone, stucco, these are what's called reservoir claddings, meaning basically they're a sponge on the outside of the house. Every time it rains or the sprinklers go off, they're gonna soak up a ton of moisture, a ton of water, and they're gonna hold that until it's time to dry. Now with brick and stone, with that air gap back there, it can actually dry to the back side as well as drying to the front side. Now we had a Tyvek house wrap on this house. This house is about 20 years old. They didn't install the windows in a particularly good fashion. You can see here they use this black kind of paper / plastic combo, and they didn't put a sill pan underneath it. So let's see if we can kind of cut this away and see what kind of rot we were looking at back there. Interesting, we have a little bit of rot, a little bit of damage. You can see there was some water getting in there. There's a little bit of mold right there and some soft OSB sheathing, but not terrible. And if we peel this Tyvek back here, you'll see this OSB here is in real good shape. We're nice and hard here. But as we come down from the corner of the window, we're starting to see a little bit more damage, especially where the bottom of that OSB is. This is pretty soft. Look at that just flaking off right there. A couple lessons here. Number one, this flashing is not doing anything. Look at this. Totally worthless at this point. It's been disintegrated after 20 years. That paper / plastic combo, it's not a great flashing at the bottom. We want to put a base wall flashing anytime we see this. But a bigger lesson here is the difference between these windows and the back of the house where we had stucco. Now on the back of the house, almost the exact same scenario, the same rot on the windows, but massive sheathing damage. The stucco applied right over a double layer of tar paper and onto the OSB. Again, a reservoir cladding soaks up all that moisture. We probably also had some extra sprinkler moisture going on in the back of the house, but it was just absolutely destroyed underneath those windows. The OSB was in terrible shape. And what's the difference between this stone here and that stucco in the back of the house? An air gap, that's the difference. The stone has a natural built-in air gap, just like a brick facade would. So there's some drying, there's some airflow, there's some drainage behind this. On the other hand, the stucco, which is applied right over a 15-pound paper, was right on the OSB. That stucco would absorb the moisture. Some of that would come to the outside and some would come to the inside, and that inside could not dry. There was no drainage, there was no airflow back there. I think the lesson here is when you're in this climate, you ought to consider an air gap behind whatever cladding you've got. An air gap is going to let a house not have damage when it gets wet. and our houses are gonna get wet. This house even has an overhang. It's not a contemporary house. We've got about a 2-foot overhang on this house. But because of that air gap, there was not a lot of damage. Where there was no air gap, there was a ton of damage. You might think about in your stucco installs, like what I'm doing, I'm using Dorkin's Delta Dry Stucco and Stone. That's an air gap product that you can put behind stucco. It's a dimple mat that's going to give you an air gap. There's a bunch of other products out there. There's 1x4s, there's core vent, there's a bunch of other things. But the lesson learned on this remodel, an air gap is going to save you. I think the other quick lesson learned here is we want to make sure that our windows have a sill pan. This is one that I've been preaching for years. We want to put that sill pan continuous underneath the window and then leave that to dry and drain to the outside. That's a huge one right here. And of course, those wood windows, they didn't fare particularly well in our climate, but these Marvins with that aluminum cladding on the outside, these are going to last for a couple of generations. Thanks for joining me, guys. For more on this topic, visit my blog at mattreisinger.com. We talk a lot about air gap and drainage and drying on my blog. There's a bunch of good product links on there too, so if you want to see more about that Dorkin Delta Dry Stucco and Stone, I've got some great videos on that. Otherwise, we'll see you next time on The Build Show.